Dear colleagues, caution, doctor, I'm going to narrate a real story, but anonymized name of Dr. Fred, who took his own life, and the story as narrated by his wife, Dr. Sally. Names anonymized, but this is a true story. Fred, the consultant, took his own life after experiencing terrible stress at work. His widow, Sally, whom the British Medical Association supported in taking legal action, says employers and the government need to realize that doctors too are human. And this is reported. And the story goes on as follows. Despite everything, Sally remembers her husband as the man he always was. The Fred who put trousers in the wash with bananas and nails in the pockets, who melted new cycling shoes in the oven by misreading the heat mold instructions. The small sportsman and proud dad, the diligent, clever doctor. What happened to Fred in his last 20 months has not tainted her memories of him, but it's hard to forget the man Fred became towards the end. The sleepless, tormented, lost soul who believed he had failed. The man who walked out of the house into the darkness on that fateful day and was found in the field the next day after a fatal overdose of insulin and antidepressants. In the years since, Sally has wanted answers. Some of those answers she has now through a successful legal action she brought against Fred's employer. She has needed to understand for herself and her teenage twins why he did it, and she wants others to understand too, to sound a warning that those in the caring professions need good care too. The tipping point. Fred was already finding his workload unmanageable before his accident. He was a diabetes and endocrinology consultant at a busy district general and had been working single-handed since his colleague and fellow endocrinologist had retired. Fred was exhausted and stressed, says Sally, and a cycling trip in Wales with his brother and friends would be a good tonic. Sport was important to him. Before cycling, he had played rugby to a high level while at medical school. But on that trip, his bike wheel clipped another's tire, catapulting him over his handlebars and resulting in a serious head injury. He spent 3.5 weeks in hospital being treated for a ventricular subdural hematoma, then a rare form of hyponatremia, cerebral salt wasting. He spent 5 restless months at home, initial speech difficulties, and facial palsy resolved within weeks, regaining the processing skills required for reading, writing, organization took longer. Yet, their discussions about his symptoms and recovery showed Fred's clinical knowledge and reasoning remained excellent. Sally says he was much more talkative, more emotional. He raged over the Brexit vote, Donald Trump's election, but he was still the same person. 5 months after his accident, occupational health cleared him to return to work. He was excited to be back. Now, the struggle to be heard. Fred raised concern over his pre-existing workload in the return to work plan. He was encouraged to write during that month, yet it would be 8 months before it was even discussed. His phased return to full-time work saw him mostly in clinic. His role covered everything from obstetrics and gynecology to obesity to transition. He was also heavily involved in developing an integrated diabetes plan across primary and secondary care on his own initiative. He had an excellent team of nurses who supported him, but he had no registrar, no colleague, says Sally. For the first month before he regained the driving license withdrawn due to injury, he would often cycle the 52-mile round trip to work. By March, there were calls for him to resume on-call work in the MAU, Medical Assessment Unit. Neither Fred nor his occupational health consultant felt he was ready for the role's fast pace and multitasking, but pressure was mounting, and the trust announced its intention to offer 7/7, that is 7 days a week, services at the government's prompting. There had also been a referral to occupational health by management, which Fred felt was unwarranted and unfair. In the months that followed, discussions focused on Fred's resuming on-call duties rather than addressing his workload more generally. As the inquest head and as the magazine of the BMA has previously reported, Fred continued to request a review of his workload. The consultant who led his first job planning meeting had no idea Fred used to have a colleague. Still, nothing changed. Finally, at a meeting, it was agreed Fred will not do on-call. His workload will be slightly reduced and he would take a pay cut. He was so stressed before the meeting because he felt he couldn't make them understand how much work he was doing, says Sally. Then he felt discriminated against because he wasn't able to do the MAU work. Now, the last days. Immediately after the meeting, he went off on sick leave for a fortnight, returned to work briefly, then went on sick leave again. His mental health deteriorated sharply. Soon, he was too anxious to walk his beloved spaniel or collect the children from the bus stop. He began having suicidal thoughts. He just shrank, went off his food, stopped sleeping, couldn't make a decision. He believed he had lost his job and felt that he had failed. The day he went missing, he was incoherent, probably psychotic, and had convinced himself he had mismanaged some of his patients. Fred slipped out at nightfall, sparking a manhunt that spanned the 26 miles between their home and the hospital. Sally, his wife, joined the search with friends. He was found in a field in their village. The coroner concluded that Fred took his life following a traumatic brain injury and work-related stress. This is a small community, and Fred had a public death, says Sally. There were police everywhere. There were even rumors that he did drugs because police told locals they were looking for the syringe he had used. I want people to know what happened, Sally says. Searching for answers. Sally wanted to make sense of what happened in the months immediately before Fred's death. He turned in on himself and didn't give me loads of detail. Her dealings with the trust management have been difficult and distressing. She has had no acknowledgement, no apology, no gesture, she says. But of this, she is convinced Fred's isolation and repeated calls for a colleague were not heeded. Much of what he did was unrecognized and unvalued, especially his work on the integrated diabetes plan, which was mostly in his own time. They never sat down with him and acknowledged all his roles and what work that entailed. His specialist work alone was more than full-time without the additional work and pressure of on-call. She has used freedom of information requests to access Fred's work emails to managers on the subject of his job plan and to look back through vacancies advertised on NHS jobs. The trust said at its inquest, they had not been able to recruit for the role of endocrinology colleague for Fred. I found no evidence of any job adverts, either through my freedom of information or legal proceedings, says Sally. Sally has also pushed to see the findings of an NHS improvement investigation into the trust's former management, which she finally achieved through court disclosure. The medical director had faced a vote of no confidence by senior clinicians. Amid accusations of bullying, he left the following year. Sally believes this report should be made public. We have to start talking openly about what happens when things go wrong, so lessons can be learned. At the moment, it seems there is a culture of fear in the NHS that shuts the conversation down. She's adamant she has no complaint against Fred's clinical colleagues, and she's clear that her complaint is against the former management of the trust, not its current executive. I know that the trust has changed and there have been masses of improvements, but openness and the acknowledgement that things didn't go right for whatever reason will mean so much to me. Now, space to recover. Sally insists that a lack of in-depth knowledge about brain injury, including among medical professionals, meant that Fred's struggle with complex processing was not recognized. She acknowledges that he hid them too for fear of looking unprofessional and later for fear of losing his job. His processing ability was assessed before his hospital discharge and never formally revisited in relation to his work. Fred looks okay, so he was assumed to be okay, says Sally. But there is a more general, more pressing point. It's important that we allow doctors to be ill and allow them the space to get better. The workload was the workload we heard at his inquest. Fred had to suffer a pay cut because he was not able to do the work in MAU, Medical Assessment Unit. This wasn't fair because he was doing the work of two consultants already. Sally was given compassionate leave after Fred's death and was supported fully in her own return to work. Her colleagues shielded her from more stressful roles. She dropped a session, even changed her day off to help establish new routines in bereavement. My colleagues said, anything you don't feel you can manage, you hand over. And I knew that was true. I felt huge guilt about being off work. You feel you are dumping colleagues in it. Fred felt hugely guilty about being off sick. Even on his last day, he was worried about his patients. He was the only consultant. We are human too. Sally wants a wider conversation about workloads for frontline workers in the NHS. In her own practice, where she's a partner, she says, we sometimes feel we are not practicing medicine as we would like to because of the pressure of time and the lack of human resource. It's dressed up as resilience and professionalism to fill in the gaps, to always do more, but you can only do so much. At some point, people will buckle and some things can make them more vulnerable. In Fred's case, a traumatic brain injury, management were too focused on what they needed Fred to do rather than what he could realistically cope with. If you are very stressed, you can't do good medicine. It's how you make an intelligent, hardworking, ethical person like Fred fail. He just burnt out. Fred didn't have a history of mental health problems. This government is not listening, but it must, because we are human too. Sally says she's banned her children from going into medicine. Now, protecting memories. Sally believes Fred would not have approved of her personal injury claim against his employer or of the settlement she's received. Fred didn't approve of people suing the NHS, and I did agree with him, but I wanted answers and truths, and taking legal action was the only way to get them. We would never seen the need to be in a trade union like the BMA before, but thank God we were, because that's how I got my answers. This was never about the money. Sally and her twins keep Fred in the conversation. They still go to the rugby, still discuss what he would have thought. He definitely wouldn't have approved of the trampoline. We are moving on with our life, but I continue to be so outraged at what happened to him. This comes with me. This is part of my future and my past. The Fred after the head injury was still Fred, with the same principles and values. He still loved his sports, still loved his family. I want him to be remembered as the person he was, so full of life and energy. Now there's help at hand, because the BMA Laws Personal Injury Scheme offers BMA members and their families free advice and representation if they are injured through the fault or negligence of a third party. This includes accidents at work, on the road, or in a public place, and disease claims. The key benefits: most other lawyers acting for personal injury claimants take a success fee of up to 25% of damages for past losses and pain or suffering. BMA law takes no such fee. Also, if you are employed under a standard NHS contract or GP partnership, BMA law can often recover for the trust or practice the cost of sick pay advance and, on occasion, locum cover. Also, if you received hospital treatment after a road accident, a successful claim ensures recovery of appropriate costs for the NHS trust providing treatment.